So yeah, this work is together with Professor Wouter and Professor Mathy Vanhoef, my supervisors or advisors in Belgium. And I will first be talking about some background of timing attacks in case people don't know what timing attacks are. After which I will explain what the server timing header is exactly and why it's used. And then I will discuss the research we have done on the prevalence of this header and which attacks we have explored in this work. So first on timing attacks. The goal of a timing attack is always to measure time in order to leak secrets. So if I were to ask the front 3 rows here to calculate 0 times 47 and raise your hand when you're done, that's very quick, right? And the back rows, if you calculate 46 times 47 and raise your hand when it's done, I won't wait for the answer, but it's going to take a bit more time. And you all realize that if you multiply a number by 0, it's going to be 0, right? You're able to calculate this very quickly, but if you have to do a more difficult product, it's going to take you more time. And in this case, if you look at the calculation time, you can infer information from that time, right? The operand, one of the operands is going to be 0. This is, of course, a dummy example and might not work in the real world, but it's similar to other timing attacks. Now, a remote timing attack is when you do these kinds of things over the internet. And that creates a couple of problems. Most notably, you have a lot of noise on the internet. If you send packets over the internet to a server, it has to be routed through to multiple, what they call middle boxes. These are routers, switches, any kind of backbone infrastructure. And a packet can be delayed in each of those boxes. So that means that if you look at the formula at the bottom of the slide, if you take a sample, when you're trying to measure execution time on a server, you're actually measuring the latency upstream noise on that latency, we call jitter, upstream jitter. You're measuring the same thing for the downstream path, and you're also measuring the time of the execution plus additional noise on that execution time. Because execution time also has noise. For example, if you're on a shared VM and other people are running heavy processes, your process might encounter more noise. Also, temperature of where your server is located might play a role in this. So those are very annoying issues, and we want to get rid of it if we want to have a more performant attack. So how do we get rid of these sources of noise? In a standard attack, you would just take more samples. If you take more samples, you're able to build a distribution, okay? And a distribution is much more easy to separate than single measurements. So you can see on this slide, in the figure, you have 2 peaks. The left one is a baseline. So let's say this is just the home page of a website. And the right one is a target, for example, /ad. Of course, this is, again, a dummy example. But let's assume that this endpoint ad returns an advertisement if the person you're visiting this web page for is between the ages of 20 and 30 years old. If they're not, this page returns a 404. We can then expect that the 404 is returned very quickly. There's no execution needed on the website, just a 404. But an ad has to be calculated on the server, there's some execution time, and it will be delayed. So in this case, you can once again see that a difference in runtime reveals the user's age. If the runtime takes longer, if the execution time takes longer, it's highly probable that this user is between the years 20 and 30 of age. Now, you can't really see this on the figure, but we are taking 2 baselines. So the left peak is actually 2 distributions on top of each other. We're doing this as a sanity check. If you don't take a second baseline, we might be measuring random stuff. So in order to make sure that we're actually separating this data and classifying it correctly, we take 2 baselines, which we have to prove are similar, and then one target value, which we have to prove is dissimilar. And in previous work, this was explored. It was explored which analyses are best used to separate these, distributions. And one of the better methods that was found is the box test. In which case, you take some percentiles out of these distributions, You basically draw a box over this distribution, and if the boxes of multiple distributions overlap, you can say these are distributions that have the same execution time. If they do not overlap, they highly likely have a different execution time. That seems to work very well, and if you look at this distribution, you can easily take percentiles and take these boxes out of them. For the server timing header, we will see later that that's much more challenging. So what is this server timing header? This is a header that was created and is now a W3C working draft. It was created for performance reasons. If developers of websites want to know how their website is performing or certain endpoints are performing, the server timing header can communicate timing information of the back end to the client side. I presume they can use this for automatic testing of their endpoints, or if people send in bug reports, they can look at the performance of that endpoint. They can debug their websites more easily. So I have an example of an actual website using this header. And as you can see, it exposes multiple metrics separated by a comma. And within each metric, for example, the processing metric has a duration property of 1175. Okay. There's also a database metric that has a duration property of 370. So the developers of this website chose to expose a lot of very detailed and fine-grained information about the database query time, about the parsing time, about the rendering time. You can also see there is multiple headers. So in this draft, they specify that multiple headers can be added, presumably because different layers in your infrastructure can just append these headers if they have server information, timing information themselves. So it might very well be that the second header, which is called CF request duration, the metric, is added by Cloudflare or Cloudflare's proxies. And also important is that in a standard, the duration property is defined as having an accuracy of 1 millisecond. So it's relatively accurate. If you go to Chrome Developer Tools and you open the Network tab, you might not be able to read this, but that's not important. I will explain. You can see they provide a waterfall model at the top of what's going on within the browser. That's including queuing time in the browser, downloading of information, DNS resolving. But the bottom section there is actually what's in the server timing header coming directly in this response. So in this case, you can see the database is the top of the three bars. Then you have the parse is the second, and the render is the bottom. So this information is actually included in the Chrome DevTools mechanisms. So let's look at the prevalence of this header. We see that if we query the HTTP archive data between 2017 and 2023, that the adoption of this header is rising. Okay. Starting in 2019, the adoption rises steadily, and then suddenly in the middle of 2022, there's a large bump. Okay. This is we found that it's due to Shopify that started using this header all of a sudden. And it increases the use of the server timing header to almost 5.5%, actually more than 6%, but including duration property, which is interesting for timing attacks, almost 5.5% of websites. If we look at the top 100 million sites, we can see that the number of server timing headers used relatively is almost the same. It's a bit less, it's almost 5.5%. But the number of sites that include the duration property is actually more significantly different. So this might be because the top 1,000 websites may actually actively choose to use this for debugging for their services, while the top 100 million websites more often will use libraries that set these headers themselves. So as I said, the main attribution goes to Shopify, the e-commerce vendor that is very big. And we can see this when we relate the server timing header to the use of the server header, that most used server header on requests that also include the server timer header is actually Cloudflare. And that is because Shopify's websites are all behind Cloudflare in some way. So Cloudflare is the largest here due to recently Shopify. Then the second one is an interesting case. The server header Pepiaka is coming from Wix, the website builder. They have some use of the server timing header, but they never include the duration property. So their websites are definitely safe against the attacks we will present here. Then I also included Nginx and Apache because they're very well-known web servers. And it's more likely that these are not setting the server timing header themselves, but the developers are actively choosing to enable this. CloudFront is the second to last row. And this is a CDN of AWS, which provides an option to enable the server timer header in their UI. So these are interesting numbers, but the question remains, are these websites vulnerable or not? We don't really know if they're vulnerable, but we do a test whether or not they provide dynamic content. If a website doesn't provide dynamic content, for example, they just provide JSON files, CSS files, we can't really leak information because they're not processing sensitive information. So what we did is, to get an ID, is we went out to 100,000 sites, we crawled them, and we saw if they had forms embedded on them. If they had, we looked if they had a same origin action for post requests, meaning that if you submit some data, it will be submitted to that same site. And it's actually this domain or this website that is processing your information, not some third-party service. So, for example, this excludes forms that are included for instance, of Google Forms. And we saw that actually 73% of the websites we crawled are dynamic in nature according to this metric. And this will be a lower bound because we didn't parse all of the endpoints of these websites, just a couple. We also briefly looked at other headers that may potentially leak timing information. We did this using multiple regular expressions. This is usually quite error-prone because a regular expression may contain a lot of false positives if you run it on headers and names of headers. So we ran a few. The bottom one is the most restrictive, which basically only tests if the header is called runtime in some way or another, so with maybe a dash or an underscore in between. And we see that almost 2% of the websites we test, so this is again from the HTTP archive database, actually returns a header that is called runtime. So I think this is really high. And if you go and look at the data, you do some manual inspection, we see that some of these headers actually include timing information that is accurate down to a microsecond. It's really accurate and not great. The top row is much more inclusive, this regular expression, and all of the server timing headers will be included in that 8.8%, also including, of course, the runtime headers and the time headers. So then on to the attack techniques that we present. First, the threat model. When you're executing timing attacks, often papers describe that an attacker can just make sure they're close to a victim, either on the same VM or in the same data center, or at least very close. This might not always be the case. Think about universities or companies hosting their websites on premises. You're never able to get a server in the same building in that case. So you have to go over the internet and do a remote timing attack. Secondly, if you created some malware or you have a stored XSS payload, your malware or XSS payload is going to be executed on a random device of some kind of user. This might be in a residential network, which has a lot of noise, high latency. So you're not in control as the attacker in that case, which device is used to mount your attack. And finally, a note to make is that we can't really do cross-site attacks, except in specific cases when you have a timing allow origin header or a course access control allow headers set. Because in order to read the server timing header values, the same origin policy restricts this if you're doing it cross-site. So for our experimental setup, we have two attacks that we described. The first one is similar to a standard direct attack, but instead of timing on the attacker device or client device, which would be the screen on scenario 1, we actually time the information on the server in scenario 1. So in this case, the server is timing how long the execution takes and is returning that information to the attacker. And if you see the equation on the top right, you see that this is the same equation I've shown before, but now for this new attack, we can basically eliminate the upstream and downstream latency and also jitter. So we have a much more detailed or much less noisy measurement of the execution time. The second attack scenario we consider is a proxied attack. Because we think that if a client device or an attacker device is in a very noisy or residential network, a proxy usually is not. A proxy is in a data center very near to the server of the victim, and is connected to this victim machine through a low latency, high bandwidth network. So if you're able to get a timing from the proxy, this will be less noisy than when you time it on your local device. So more in detail, for the clients, we used the university internally private cloud and a residential network, both to test both scenarios. And as a server, we used Google Cloud instances in Europe, in Belgium, and in Virginia in the United States. And we set up an Nginx server that returned a server timing header with a duration property that included the request time global variable from Nginx, which returns the full request time. So in case of the example I've shown for the server timer header, this included specific timings for example, database queries or rendering time, processing time. If you were to test these things, you would expect that the performance of the attack you're trying to execute is going up even more, because these are specific timings. And the configurations we tested is basically all the different configurations you can think of: Europe to Europe, Europe to US, and for the proxied attack, proxying both through Europe and the US to servers in Europe and the US. So now I'm going back to the data analysis. I've told you that we can use the box test on this regular data before, but it's very difficult to do a box test on the data we have from the server timing header values. You can see on the right side, once again, a sort of a distribution. This one is less perfect than the previous one I showed, but you can still do a box test on this. You can calculate percentiles and stuff like that. Now, if you were to take the similar information and return it in a server timing header that has an accuracy of 1 millisecond, you would get something like this. So this is a less accurate distribution, and you can't really take percentiles of this distribution. So what we had to do is we had to find another statistic. We tested 4. The chi-squared contingency test worked the best. And what we then did is, which is actually a methodology that is used often in timing attacks, we did 1,000 attacks, and when we were able to differentiate the baselines and the target distributions, in more than 95% of the cases, we consider this attack successful. And this worked with the chi-squared contingency test. So there's some results here. This is a big table, but I'll walk you through it. These are the results of the proxied attack, and you could find the direct attack, which has similar results in the paper. So the top half of the paper is the standard round trip time, which we test on the same data in order to be able to compare. And the bottom half is the new attack with the server timing. And one of the things you will see is that if you compare the top half to the bottom half needs way less samples. So the amount of samples you would require to differentiate two distributions is much smaller. And secondly, the timing difference that you can differentiate is also smaller. So where you have limits on 100 microseconds in the standard attack, you can potentially discover differences of 20 microseconds using the server timing header. And in some cases, you can also see that, well, that's not perfect, but you can also see that the university network and the residential network show similar results, where in the standard timing attack, they do not show similar results due to the increased noise in the residential network. So how do you defend against this? Ideally, you wouldn't use the server timing header in production, and the W3C draft also, in their security considerations, say that you best not expose this header to unauthenticated endpoints. But all the websites we crawled are unauthenticated because we didn't do authenticated crawls. So all of these websites are already violating the security considerations of the W3C draft. And so an alternative is to make educated decisions where to expose. Because even if you expose it on authenticated endpoints only, the attacker can still authenticate themselves if they have an endpoint where they can leak information about other users of the system when they're authenticated themselves. And so a full solution would be don't use sensitive timing values if you return the information, but that's obviously very difficult. And partial solutions include rounding timing values to, for example, 5 milliseconds or 10 milliseconds, or padding these sensitive operations. But these are things that are partial solutions because they're basically just adding more noise. And if you add more noise, you can always take more measurements. Of course, it's possible that attacking is infeasible if you have to take more measurements in that case. But they're not perfect solutions. It's very difficult in general to defend against this. And if you send these type of attacks to companies and vendors, they're not often willing to try to solve these types of timing leaks. Which we also see because we sent this to the W3C authors of the draft. And we also sent it to Shopify, not because we found specific vulnerabilities, but just because we wanted to inform them about the fact that they are using this header, they are exposing some information that is quite specific. And we just want them to know about this and to be able to possibly prevent future leaks. But we haven't received any responses as of now. So in conclusion, server timing headers do enable these types of timing attacks, and more sites are starting to use it, including the duration property, which is sometimes dangerous. We have explored the direct and proxy attack methods that we constructed, and we show that the use of this header in such an attack improves the timing attack performance, and we're still awaiting the response to our disclosures, because we actually would like to see changes to the W3C draft, if possible. So here's my information if you want to contact me later, and thanks.
Very nice talk. Can you comment a little bit on, for example, there is this performance timing API in browsers, which I think was well known, exposes information that is being exploited for various fingerprinting attacks. This seems like the other side of the coin, where information is being exposed from the server side. What are the lessons in your mind that you can learn from how that whole episode of performance timing played out in the browser? Maybe we can apply the same lessons to server timing.
Yeah, in general, I think I've seen a discussion once between people that work on performance and people that work on security. People that work on performance, in that case, wanted to expose a lot of information because it makes it easier to evaluate the performance and debug their services. But people in security don't want that because you're exposing information. And I think, I'm not sure about the process in this case, but they just might not have thought about these timing attacks when they were constructing the W3 standard. And I think it's important if we think about these new drafts of the W3C that are coming out, that maybe they should work together with people from other areas instead of looking only at performance. Right? Because I think it's pretty clear that the security considerations are not strict enough on this draft. And I suppose if people that work in security are looking at this, they might have caught it.
Yeah, but in the performance timing API in web browsers, I think they eventually reduced the timing granularity to, if I remember correctly, 1 millisecond, and that was considered acceptable. Is that like a mitigation that would be worked here as well, just reduce the granularity?
Yeah, so if you reduce the granularity, you create basically noise. You need more samples to exploit the technique, but it's not a full solution. Maybe there are techniques to circumvent that, because in that case, when the timing was reduced to 1 millisecond, people still found ways to get more accurate timings in browsers anyways. I think it's always a sort of an arms race between defending against these things and finding new